Hello everybody, welcome back to Screenstars. Welcome to another of my Jean-Claude Van Damme classic reviews. Today I am taking a look at the 1989 science fiction action film Cyborg. The film is written and directed by Albert Pion and it stars, of course, Jean-Claude Van Damme as well as Deborah Richter, Victor Klin, Dale Haddon and Ralph Muller. Right, the film follows Jean-Claude Van Damme's character Gibson, who is a slinger, essentially. Now, this is a post-apocalyptic film. It's set sometime in the future. Like, disease has wiped out the majority of humanity, and all that is left is, like, you know, gangs that kind of ravage the wasteland. Jean-Claude Van Damme is like a slinger, so he's kind of like an old-style gunslinger in the Old West sort of thing. He'll work for money, all that kind of stuff. And he happens across a cyborg who has got the secret within her to potentially end this plague and give humanity a real fight for survival. However, there is a gang of savages led by Fender who want to get the hold of this cyborg because they don't want the cure. They like the world the way it is, and they're hell-bent on tracking down this cyborg and Van Damme in order to own the secret of this cure. Right. What are my thoughts on Cyborg? Well, this came at a time in Van Damme's career where he was red hot, this film. You know, he'd done Bloodsport and Kickboxer. I think this might have been his third, like, major feature. I know he did things before, like No Retreat, No Surrender, and things like that. And this was a Canon release. Now, this was originally, on my understanding, is going to be offered to Chuck Norris. Obviously, we know Chuck Norris was a big star player for Canon. But because he was so hot after Bloodsport and Kickboxer, Van Damme, they wanted to offer it to him, pretty much. So Van Damme starred in this film. Now, at the time when I first saw this film, I was like, wow, I was on board the Van Damme train. He was so impressive to watch as a martial artist. It was really exciting. And both Bloodsport and Kickboxer, if you like, were very, very similar films in many ways. You know what I mean? There were combat films, you know what I mean? There were fighting films, and they followed a similar pattern in a lot of ways. This one was like a real departure, certainly for me, and I struggled initially when I first saw this film. I wasn't overly keen on it, because he wasn't portraying like this, you know, incredible martial artist that, you know, nobody with skills that nobody can match and stuff like that. He gets, you know, battered in this film, essentially, Van Damme. You know, he gets tortured, he gets crucified. Obviously, he has his moments against some of the villains here in this, but for the most part, he is an underdog here in this film up against this gang of, you know, wasteland savages. And I kind of, when I was younger, I kind of struggled with that a little bit, and I couldn't get on board with it. It didn't help as well that, you know, with this being canon, it was, you know, they were legendary for being cheapskates. And, you know, like the cyborg effects were not good even back in the day, from certainly when I remember first watching it, and definitely not anymore. Some of the sets were okay, and I think they reused a lot of the stuff from the Masters of the Universe film, you know what I mean? Certainly a lot of the costumes and some of the sets and things like that, they kind of reused from that movie. So I thought like the locations and stuff kind of did the job. It looked quite post-apocalyptic and it felt like a really grim world. It just kind of didn't, I don't know, certainly when I was younger. Now, as I'm older, I've learned to appreciate this film a little bit more. The fact that Van Damme actually did take a little bit of a risk with this film. Apparently, he's not actually keen on this film. He wasn't, certainly at the time. And the vision for this film by the director Albert Pion was very, very different. Apparently, initially, it was going to be like black and white, very dark, very violent. I think a lot of Van Damme's lines were dubbed and all this kind of stuff. And when it was test screened, everybody hated it. So Van Damme convinced Canon to let him and Sheldon Lettis, I believe it was, to re-edit the film, recut it. And once they presented that, they released that version, sort of thing, which is the version that we got. So there are certainly great moments in this film, I think, great moments of action. I think one of the things this film has going for it, for sure, is a very, very strong villain, this Fender, who, you know, was quite terrifying and very menacing, and had quite an impact on me when I was young. You really felt like Van Damme had very little chance against this guy. And it was a smart move. To give a heroic character a strong villain is always the best idea, and the film certainly got that right. Other areas that I think this film got wrong, it didn't focus enough on the cyborg. Do you know what I mean? It was almost like that was a plot device to get Van Damme doing what he was doing. And he has like a sidekick along the way, played by Deborah Richter. That it just didn't work. There was no chemistry between her and Van Damme. You wasn't sure if it was meant to be a romantic thing, but it just didn't feel like it fit the film. But the storyline of Van Damme and his family being certainly his wife and child. Well, I'm not sure if it was. No, it wasn't his wife and child. They were killed by Fender. It gave Van Damme this real, you know, motivation for revenge and vengeance sort of thing. But I think they could have played on that a lot more in the film, in a sense of, is he really doing this to help humanity and help the cyborg? Is he really doing this because he wants revenge on Fender, or is it just a coincidence that it's Fender that killed his family, sort of thing? So I think there are areas of this film that I think if they'd have elevated the writing a little bit more, focused a little bit more on some of the side characters, and what I mean by that is, like, there were some members of, like, the gang, this Wasteland gang, that was led by Fender, that had the potential to kind of be memorable, because he has a number of fight scenes with some of them, and some of them get memorable deaths, sort of thing. The Ralph Muller character, for example, this was one of his very early roles. He could barely speak English. He was very, very thick German accent, and I believe his lines were dubbed as well. Not that he had many lines. He has that memorable death, you know, with Van Damme lying in between the walls, and he kind of stabs him from above, and a couple of other sort of things, but it would have had more impact if the characters had been more fleshed out. So I think this is a good film in Jean-Claude Van Damme's filmography. It's a little bit of an oddity in a sense of it. For his early films, it feels like it's the odd one out, and it doesn't necessarily fit with the pattern of his earlier films, sort of thing. But it is a film that, you know, as you kind of mature and watch over the years, you can kind of separate it from his early work and kind of look at it as its own standalone piece. And there are a lot of good ideas here that don't all necessarily work. And I think if Canon had have invested a little bit more money into this, but to be fair, they just didn't have the finances at the time. They were pretty much bankrupt, and I think this was their last cinematic release before Canon went bankrupt, which is a shame. And interestingly as well, I was researching this, and apparently Van Damme permanently blinded someone in one of their eyes in one of the fight scenes with Sword. And apparently he took him to court and got a settlement eventually. Interesting. So yeah, I think, like I say, this is a good Jean-Claude Van Damme film. I think if you had never seen a Van Damme film and this was the first film you chose to put on, you'd be kind of like, what is this? It's fundamentally, in a lot of ways, not a well-made film, but in other ways, it's a low budget, cheap, post-apocalyptic, like, action martial arts film. So it kind of fits in that bracket of like an action martial arts film. But if you're looking for a top quality action film, then it's not going to fit into that category. So you can't score it accordingly into that, you know what I mean? If you look at IMDb, this is rated quite low, sort of thing. I think that unfairly so. I think this is certainly a well above average film in regards to Jean-Claude Van Damme's filmography. But overall, it's definitely not one of his strongest. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the review. I'll be back with more reviews and content on the channel very, very soon.